Hi, I'm Joan Capps from James A. Garfield National Historic Site. Nice to see you all again. So I'm glad you all came today. Our topic today is Reinventing Freedom, the importance of the 14th Amendment. I proposed this topic to Todd Arrington about a year ago, which was the 150th anniversary, and went, oh, that's kind of interesting. And he said, oh, you want to do it in July when it'll be the 151st? I said, no, that doesn't matter. But of course, I had done absolutely no research about the 14th Amendment at that point. So this is what I've learned since then. And before we, in order to begin, I want to explain the title, Reinventing Freedom, because the 14th Amendment really redrew what the Constitution meant. In the years before the Civil War, from the founding, even under the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution as it was first written, there were two intertwined threads of American thinking about freedom, rights, and equality. The brightly colored thread came out of the Declaration of Independence, and it naturalized rights and made them universal. It said all men are created equal. That's our founding principle, right? All men are created equal. The Constitution didn't quite say that when it was written. So the second, more inconspicuous, but also arguably most powerful thread was localized rights. This is the way Americans thought about their specific area, their boundaries. When the Constitution was written, it was written to loosely organized 13 independent states. And most of the power stayed with the states and the communities in those states to write laws and to divide what the citizens of those states' rights and privileges were. And people were seen as citizens of each of those states. And that continued as states were added. They understood each other less as discrete individual people, but rather as members of a group that was defined by things like sex or race or wealth or kinship, religion, persistence in the community. So these groups were unequal, and their inequality was marked by differences in status and privilege. Local governance consisted of a collective order of duties and privileges rather than universal rights. And as long as citizenship remained local, as it always had been in the United States, citizens were manifestly unequal. And it was pretty obvious as you travel from one place to another in the country where citizens' rights were different from place to place. So let's start our story of the 14th Amendment on a date you'll all recognize, April 15th, 1865. On the morning of April 15th, Abraham Lincoln had a cabinet meeting. Lee's army had already surrendered, right? And everybody was very optimistic. The war is essentially at an end. There's still fighting going on. Not all of the rebel armies had surrendered, but everybody was optimistic that very soon the rebellion would be completely eliminated. So they started thinking about how to reconstruct the country. And that's what dominated the conversation of the cabinet meeting that morning. This is Edwin Stanton. He was the Secretary of War, and he had devised a plan for military occupation and rule over North Carolina and Virginia after Lee's army surrendered, and he sent that to the president day and a half before. So that was the topic of the conversation, and Stanton's plan was to set up a military government for the two states combined, and the rest of the cabinet thought, most of the plan was good, but they didn't want to divide, they didn't want to merge two states together, because all through the war, almost all of the cabinet and the president recognized the states as they had been before they left. So as political entities, they still recognized Virginia and North Carolina as separate states, and so they wanted to devise a plan for the political reorganization that recognized their original state boundaries. So Stanton's going to go back to the drawing board with that idea. Then Lincoln went to a play and was shot. And so on the morning of April 15th, or April 16th, he died, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was sworn in as the 17th president. General Joseph E. Johnson, no relative as far as I know, surrendered on April 25th, about a week later. President Johnson declared armed resistance all across the country had ended on May the 10th. So actually, that's the date the Civil War ended. And by the date of Lincoln's assassination, April 15th, 21 states had ratified the 13th Amendment, the amendment that abolished slavery. So it is now up to the 17th president, Andrew Johnson, to oversee the Reconstruction. So who is Andrew Johnson? From Tennessee. He was a Union supporter all his life, and that's why he was on the ticket with Lincoln in 1864, because he wanted to recognize, and in places where they, like the border states, where there are a lot of loyal Democrats, he wanted that Democratic support for the Union ticket, as they called the Republican ticket that year. So Andrew Johnson was there to bring in all of those Democrats. So he was a Democrat, capital D and capital all those other letters. He was an all caps Democrat. And so now he was in charge of presidential Reconstruction, which of course was not necessarily what Republicans had in mind. So here's his plan. He appointed provisional governors in all of the seceded states. Very often they were people who had held power in those states before the Civil War started. A lot of them were people he knew from his political career. And he required that those provisional governors call special conventions to draft new constitutions for each of those states. And the new constitution, in order to be recognized by the federal government, had to abolish slavery, recognize the 13th Amendment, and renounce secession, saying, yeah, that was a mistake, we shouldn't have done that. In order to accomplish this, Johnson offered amnesty to nearly all the rebels, as long as they pledged future loyalty. It was a blanket amnesty for most men in the Confederacy, but high-ranking officers and people high-ranking in local governments had to get special individual amnesties from the president. So he went into the business of giving out amnesties, and most of those gentlemen thought it was a little bit undignified to ask for amnesty themselves, so they sent their wives. And so Andrew Johnson was really enjoying all these ladies coming to the White House and begging for amnesty for their husbands and maybe their sons and cousins and various things, and a certain amount of money and other things may have transpired in order to get those amnesties, but it was quite a scene at the White House. Once those people got amnesties, they were eligible to vote for the members of the special convention, and then for the new constitutions once they were written. Very specifically, emancipated blacks were not eligible to vote. I mean, it was part of the plan. So once the new state governments were organized and their constitutions were passed, they would be able to send representatives to Congress. But they also got to work trying as best they could to get things back as near to slavery as possible. So they wrote a whole bunch of laws called the Black Codes. Generally, the Black Codes recognized that the blacks were now free and therefore were allowed to acquire and own property, to marry, as long as it was within their race, to make contracts, to sue and be sued, and to testify in court cases involving people of their own color. Now that the blacks were freed, the way that they were allowed to work was under contract, right? Because they're free people, so they can contract for their labor. But the state enforced the labor agreements. And they enforced plantation discipline. So almost all slaves had very little choice except to contract for their labor for the same people that they had been slaves to. And then it was the state's police responsibility to maintain those contracts, which of course the black people were free to sign. And generally they were for a one-year term. If you didn't want to sign one of those contracts and contract yourself onto a farm, you did have a couple of other options. A lot of black folks before the war did things like carpentry or blacksmithing, or they were barbers or whatever. They were independent folks who had their own businesses, right? Some of them were still slaves and the money went to their owners, but still they had skills and abilities that were not on the plantations. So if you want to do something like that, they wrote up this whole list of taxes or permits that you had to buy in order to do any of those kinds of jobs. So if there were anything except a farmer or a servant, you had to buy a license, essentially, to do that kind of work. Even preaching was taxed. So that was one of the ways to control the labor of the black population. Thaddeus Stevens, whose name will come up over and over again today, was one of the most radical members of Congress. He described our 17th president as, at heart, a damned scoundrel. Let me know at the end if you agree with him. Now, how come Andrew Johnson and his presidential Reconstruction was able to move along this train for such a long time? Because Congress, the 38th Congress adjourned on March the 4th, the day that Lincoln and Andrew Johnson were inaugurated. And they didn't meet again until December 4th, 1865. So all through the spring and summer and fall of 1865, Andrew Johnson was the only person in charge of Reconstruction, right? That's how he was able to get his presidential Reconstruction plan in place, and all of these state governments were able to be established and state constitutions written up. So the 39th Congress, which was elected in 1864, consisted of 136 Republicans, 38 Democrats, and 19 members of minor parties, mostly quasi-Republicans, in the House of Representatives. 39 Republicans, 11 Democrats, and 4 minor party members of the Senate. So the Republicans have a lock on the Congress, essentially, right? But they couldn't do anything until Congress met. And they didn't meet until December the 4th, 1865, for their first session. Lincoln said that he thought it was providential that this great rebellion was crushed just as Congress had adjourned, because he thought he and his cabinet were more likely to accomplish more without them than with them regarding Reconstruction. He noted that there were men in Congress who, if their motives were good, were nevertheless impracticable, and who possessed feelings of hate and vindictiveness in which he did not sympathize and could not participate. He hoped there would be no persecution, no bloody work after the war was over. Of course, everybody might ask, what would Lincoln do? But Lincoln didn't have a chance to do it, and would the bloody work have happened had Lincoln survived is a question, of course, we cannot answer. So by the time the 39th Congress met in December of 1865, 3 states, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Louisiana, had been declared reconstructed, and they sent members to the new Congress. And the Congress refused to seat them. So now we have to decide, 1, what we're going to do about Reconstruction, because we don't agree with the president's plan, and 2, what are we going to do about these congressmen who are knocking on the door here wanting to get in? Now, Congress has within its rights, according to the Constitution, to seat or not seat anybody they choose. So they were perfectly within their rights to say, nope, we're not seating you. But being Congress, guess what they did? They established a committee. The Joint Committee on Reconstruction was established to investigate conditions in the South and to report if any states were entitled to readmission to Congress. There were 15 members, 9 from the House, 6 from the Senate, primarily Republicans. They did throw a couple of Democrats in, just to say we're bipartisan. But they were kind of rare on the ground anyway, so it's not surprising that it was overwhelmingly Republicans. So, being a committee of Congress, they took testimony over months and months and months. They sent people to the southern states who brought back reports on conditions down there. They talked to soldiers, to Freedmen's Bureau agents, to Southern Unionists. They took all their testimony behind closed doors, and in the end wrote a report that we'll come back to a little bit later on of the Joint Committee, which was done before the session of Congress ended. But while all this was going on, there's still the issue of what's actually happening in the South. So the Congress got to work first to reapprove the Freedmen's Bureau bill. Freedmen's Bureau was established in the last year of the war because by that time, as Union armies were advancing throughout the South, and a whole lot of slaves were voting with their feet and getting themselves behind Union lines, and it became very, very clear that something needed to be done to help out these newly freed slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau was established. It was intended to be temporary, to last 1 year after the end of hostilities. So that would have been until March of 66, or May of 66, I guess. So they wanted to reauthorize and extend the Freedmen's Bureau bill. So they wrote House Resolution 613. And this bill wanted to counteract the black codes that were being passed all over the South, to give the Freedmen's Bureau judicial powers to protect against discrimination under the black codes, and to otherwise expand the reach that they had under the original Freedmen's Bureau bill. Now, this is what most people think about when they think of the Freedmen's Bureau. They ran schools, right? Everybody knows that one of the first things the Freedmen's Bureau did was to establish schools for blacks in the South, because up until the Civil War, any education of slaves was prohibited by law. And in order to establish and maintain democracy, you need an educated population. So the very first thing the Republicans saw as a necessity was educating the newly freed blacks. So among the first activities of the Freedmen's Bureau was to establish schools. But they also did other things. They helped with buying land, which, everybody, the communications between black folks is absolutely amazing, and everybody heard about the 40 acres and a mule, which was never law, but everybody was waiting for their 40 acres and a mule, right? And there were some pieces of land that had been confiscated by the federal government that the Freedmen's Bureau helped blacks buy. Unfortunately, most of those sales were overturned later on. So they helped with that. They did, with the judicial powers that were in this bill, have the opportunity to protect black rights to some extent. They did help folks contract for their labor under the black codes. So that was one of the things. In the North, the Freedmen Bureau was seen this way. Look at all us hardworking white yeoman farmers all over the country who had fought this war and freed the slaves, and now they're just relaxing and living off the federal government. This was the Northern perception of what the Freedmen's Bureau bill, what the Freedmen's Bureau was all about. So Johnson vetoed it. In his veto message, Johnson suggested that Congress has no right to pass any bill affecting the interests of the late Confederate states while they're not represented in Congress. And of course, Congress had refused to seat any of those new members. So basically, what he was saying was the 39th Congress might as well fold up their tent and go home, because they don't have the right to do anything as long as the southern states were not represented in Congress. He said, and this is wonderfully politically correct, I think, I share with Congress the strongest desire to secure the freedmen in the full enjoyment of their freedom and property and their entire independence and equality in making contracts for their labor. However, he objected to the Bureau courts, and he also said that freedmen should be protected, but should be protected by the civil authorities, especially by the exercise of all the constitutional powers of the courts of the United States and the states. And he thought that most of the power needed to remain with each state. So, Freedmen's Bureau bill having been vetoed, Congress moved on to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This was their response to the veto. It was introduced by Senator Lyman Trumbull, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he said it was one of the most important bills ever presented to the House for its action. It granted civil rights to all persons born in the United States except Indians not on reservations. The rights included making contracts, bringing lawsuits, and enjoying, quote, full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property. It was, in that law, was the first statutory definition of the rights of American citizenship rather than state citizenship. Of course, it was hotly debated, and I'd like to share a little bit of that debate with you. Senator Lot Morrill, who was from Maine, was arguing in the Senate with Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky. And he said, the senator from Kentucky tells us that the proposition is revolutionary, and he thinks that's an objection. I freely concede that it's revolutionary. I admit that this species of legislation is absolutely revolutionary. But are we not in the midst of a revolution? Is the senator from Kentucky utterly oblivious to the grand results of 4 years of war? Are we not in the midst of a civil and political revolution which has changed the fundamental principles of our government in some respect? So, Civil Rights Bill passed by Congress, was passed in the Congress March 13th, 1866, and it was vetoed. And for the first time in American history, that a major piece of legislation was passed overriding a presidential veto. The Civil Rights Bill was overridden by the Congress April 6, 1866. When Johnson vetoed the bill, of course, his veto statement was very, very long, very complicated, printed in every newspaper in the country. But he said among the reasons that he vetoed the bill is he rejected the idea that black people or any non-white Americans were really citizens of the United States. He said, this provision comprehends the Chinese of the Pacific states, Indians subject to taxation, the people called gypsies, as well as the entire race designated as blacks, people of color, Negroes, mulattoes, and persons of African blood. Is it sound policy to make our entire colored population and all other accepted classes citizens of the United States? One of the congressmen said, I've heard more talk about gypsies this week than I've heard my whole life. So, the Civil Rights Bill becomes law, April 6th, 1866. Meanwhile, the Joint Commission is watching all this debate and participating in all this debate and voting in all this debate and recognizing that legislation can be overturned. Presidents can veto it. We might be able to overcome a veto today. We'll be able to tomorrow. Will we lose our majority in the Senate, in the House or the Senate, and then not be able to override a veto? Will all the protections that we just voted for disappear? So they decided that the only way to ensure those protections was to write them into the Constitution. And that's when they began drafting the 14th Amendment. So Senator William Pitt Fessenden of Maine was the chairman of the Joint Committee. Congressman John Bingham of Ohio, he's from the Cincinnati area, was the primary writer of the 14th Amendment. Now, there are some amendments in the Constitution, there's quite a lot of them actually, that deal with narrow immediate concerns and can be thought of sort of as statutes writ large, like, prohibition and then let's undo prohibition, two different amendments in the Constitution, changing the voting age, the 25th Amendment, things like that are just statutes that are codified in the Constitution themselves. They give constitutional form, but then there are amendments like the 14th. And the 14th gives constitutional form to resolve a national crisis and permanently alter American nationality. The 14th Amendment, in language, transcended race and region. It challenged legal discrimination throughout the nation and changed and broadened the meaning of freedom. So this was a big amendment, not only in its length and the number of words, and by the way, it's the biggest, in its idea. It's the whole enchilada here. But it started out pretty small. When Bingham wrote his first draft of the 14th Amendment, this is what he asked for. Congress shall have the power to make all laws, which shall be necessary and proper to secure the citizens of each state all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and to all persons in the several states equal protection of the rights to life, liberty, and property. That was it. It was the whole 14th Amendment, first draft. Yeah, it didn't seem to quite fill all the necessities that people saw as being needed. And of course, they're legislators, so they have to massage the language a lot. As debate continued, and especially following the veto of the Civil Rights Act, it became really clear that Congress's vision of Reconstruction needed to define American citizenship and to protect individual rights from government interference. While the debate was going on, there was a race riot in Memphis, Tennessee on May the 1st. Now, there had been a lot of racial strife all over the South and some in the North, all spring and summer long. Most of them were fairly localized and not necessarily noticed all across the country. This one certainly was. It began with a traffic accident. A white carriage driver and a black carriage driver crashed, got out, had words. Police were called. The police in Memphis, Tennessee were mostly Irish. So black folks in the area started having it out with the cops, and it resulted in 3 days of rioting with white mobs, mostly Irish police and firemen, and a whole lot of black soldiers from Fort Pickering. 48 people died, all but 2 of them black. 5 black women were raped, and most of the black quarter, South Memphis, was destroyed, it was burned. So this made national news. And it gave argument to the fact that the civil rights law was not protecting folks as much as they had hoped it would. Andrew Johnson pretended he didn't see. A few days later, well, actually the day before the Memphis riot, the 14th Amendment was reported to Congress out of the Joint Committee. And Thaddeus Stevens was put in charge of the debate in the House. On March the 7th, or May the 7th rather, Thaddeus Stevens said, "In rebuilding, it is necessary to clear away the rotten and defective portion of the old foundations and to sink deep and found the repaired edifice upon a firm foundation of eternal justice." Now, Thaddeus Stevens was a radical Republican, an abolitionist of very long standing. By the time of the debate in Congress, he had seen a whole lot of debates about the ending of slavery and the rights of black folks. And he was old and he was tired, but he was also a very practical politician. He knew what he could get and what probably couldn't happen. And so he admitted that the proposed amendment was a compromise. "It falls far short of my wishes," he said, "but it fulfills my hopes. I believe it is all that can be obtained in the present state of public opinion." He said that the amendment was the beginning of a process that would rebuild the nation around the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. So, let's see what Congress was talking about. As I said, it's the longest amendment we've got. Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Put the cart before the horse, right? They're citizens of the United States. Their state citizenship derives from that. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person, citizen or not, within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So for the first time, what it means to be a citizen of the United States is defined. And very importantly, it overturned Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a Supreme Court decision before the Civil War, written by Roger B. Taney in 1857, who said that at the time the Constitution was written, black people were regarded as being of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So, born in the United States, according to the first section of the 14th Amendment, black folks are citizens of the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and entitled to all the rights and privileges of citizenship. It completely overturned Dred Scott. Stevens said that Section 1 allows Congress to correct the unjust legislation of the states so far as the law which operates upon one man shall operate equally upon all. This was the major argument that the radicals were making in this proposed amendment, was that we're not really changing the law. We're just saying that the law applies to everybody the same way. And You might not have been doing that before, but you're going to start to do it now. Whatever law punishes a white man for a crime shall punish the black man precisely the same way and to the same degree. Whatever law protects the white man shall afford equal protection to the black man. The amendment was necessary despite the Civil Rights Act, not because the act was unconstitutional, he said, but because the law is repealable by a majority. And I need hardly say that the first time the South and their Copperhead allies obtain command of Congress, it will be repealed. So when Bingham, who wrote provided the wordage for the 14th Amendment, defended this section, he said it was a necessity for the completion of the work of the framers. There was a want hitherto, he said, and there remains a want now in the Constitution of our country, which the proposed amendment will supply. What is that? It's the power of the people, the whole people of the United States, by express authority of the Constitution, to do that by congressional enactment, which hitherto they have not had the power to do. That is, to protect the national law and privileges and immunities of all citizens of the Republic and the inborn rights of every person within its jurisdiction, whenever the same shall be abridged or denied by unconstitutional acts of the states. So remember, in Bingham's first draft, he gave positive authority to the Congress to pass laws to protect folks. By the time they got to the third draft, they are now making a negative statement. No state shall. So they're defining a way what states saw as their rights before, which Bingham argued they never had. Senator Jacob M. Howard of Michigan led the debate in the Senate, and he explained that the committee's draft section by section. Remarkably enough, he noted, to this point in American history, there was no clear legal definition of citizen of the United States. And as for citizens' privileges and immunities, he said, they include the personal rights guaranteed and secured by the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, such as freedom of speech and the press. They were very clear in the debate in Congress that the point of the 14th Amendment was to secure to all people the rights and privileges that were encoded in the first 8 amendments in the Bill of Rights. The last 2 clauses of the first section of the amendment disable a state from depriving not merely a citizen of the United States, but any person, whoever he may be, of life, liberty, or property without due process, or from denying to him equal protection of the laws of the state. This abolishes all class legislation and does away with the injustice of subjecting one caste of persons to a code not applicable to another. Section 2 has the most words. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. That means Indians on reservations. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for President and Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the legislature thereof is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in proportion which the numbers of such male citizens shall bear the whole number of male citizens, and so on and so on. Here's the deal. In the original Constitution, they had the 3/5ths Clause, right? Everybody in the country is going to get counted, and representation in Congress is going to be based on that census, except that we're going to count the black people as 3/5ths. So we take the whole number of black people, divide by 3/5ths, and add that number to the census count for each state, and decide how many members of Congress they get based on that 3/5ths rule. Well, now everybody is a citizen. So we're going to count all those black folks as whole people. And that means southern states have larger populations, and that means southern states get larger congressional delegations. Now, this could be a problem once we let those folks back in, right? Because pretty soon they're going to be able to outvote us. So, their plan, this section was their answer to that. If you let the black folks vote, in the same way you let white folks vote, and voting has always been a state responsibility to set up rules for who was eligible to vote and who was not. So if you let black folks vote, everybody counts in your population and you will be represented in Congress based on that. But if you exclude those black adult males from voting, by the percentage that they make up in your population, we're going to reduce your census count and therefore the number of members of Congress that you get. So that was their answer to the 3/5 problem. To Stevens, the practical politician, this second section was the most important in the article because it would either compel the states to grant universal suffrage or so shear them of their power as to keep them forever in a hopeless minority in the national government. So it was a very complicated way to try to encourage suffrage for the newly freed slaves. Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3, remove such disability. This is the answer to President Johnson's amnesty. They pretty much agreed that the vast majority of Southern men could receive amnesty. But if you, in your life before the Civil War, had taken an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and then you rebelled, you ain't getting an amnesty. So this kind of lopped off the whole top tier of political and military folks in the South. And all those people who were appointed to governorships and so on by Andrew Johnson, and most of the people who had written the new constitutions of the states under Andrew Johnson had, in previous lives, held political positions where they took an oath to the Constitution of the United States that they then rebelled against. So the cream of the Southern political crop was disabled from holding any position in the new, once they came back into the Union. This one's kind of interesting. Section 4, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts occurring for payment of pensions and bounties for service in suppressing the insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss of or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. So not only does it say that the federal government is not going to pay the debts incurred by the Confederacy, the Confederate states, if they come back into the Union, can't accept that debt and try to repay it themselves. All that debt is illegal and void. But the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. And the reason I say that's interesting is, I don't know if any of you here remember a few years ago when there was a threat to not pass a debt limit. Some people went back to this, to Section 4 of the 14th Amendment and said, the debt limit doesn't mean anything because Section 4 of the 14th Amendment says that the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. So sometimes lingering deep in the depths, are interesting little things that come up. On the Section 4, Stevens said that the debt guarantees needed no defense. None dare object who is not himself a rebel. Yeah, probably owed money by somebody, all right? This is the most important, other than Section 1, section of the 14th Amendment. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. This same sentence appears as Section 2 of the 13th Amendment. It does not appear in any of the articles in the Bill of Rights. So that, Bingham said, was the problem, that the Bill of Rights existed, and it existed for everybody, but the Congress didn't have any authority to enforce by legislation the Bill of Rights until it was enacted here in the 14th Amendment. So now Congress has power to protect all the rights in the Bill of Rights all across the country. The unified aim of the 14th Amendment was a union based on universal liberty, impartial justice, and equal rights, a union of truly democratic states. Both houses of the Congress agreed to the amendment on June 18, 1866, and sent it off to the states for ratification. This was essentially the Radical Republicans' Reconstruction plan in constitutional amendment form. Congress required that the southern states had to ratify the 14th Amendment before they would be readmitted to the Union, and Republicans hoped that the amendment would protect black rights, adjust representation according to suffrage, nip future secession ambitions in the bud, invalidate the Confederate debt, and keep the South from falling into obviously disloyal hands. And if things didn't go as hoped, they had Section 5. An amendment to, so they could undo anything that didn't seem to be going right. Not surprisingly, Andrew Johnson sent the Congress a special message to make clear his opposition to any amendment at all. In proposing an amendment, the president is not involved at all. It's either written by Congress or you can call it constitutional convention, which nobody's ever dared to do. So it's written by Congress, voted by Congress, sent off to the states. And the president has no involvement in it at all. But of course, Andrew Johnson had his say. And he sent a special message to make clear his opposition. He said, in no sense whatever does sending this to the states commit the executive to approval or recommendation of the amendment. This was a signal to the southern states, to their governments, that they should reject the amendment. Tennessee, Johnson's home state, was the first state to consider the amendment, and it did ratify. Not only because the governor was a radical, his name was Brownlow, was a unionist, but more importantly, he really, really hated Andrew Johnson. He had a bit of a time getting it through the Tennessee legislature, but he sent a measure to, when it was finally passed, he sent a message to John Bingham, and he said, "Battle fought and won. The amendment was ratified in the House today by 43 to 11. Give my compliments to the dirty dog in the White House." So the Republicans in Congress immediately voted to seat Tennessee's members because they had ratified the 14th Amendment. So it goes off to the states along with the report of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. The first quote up there is Carl Schurz. If Andrew Johnson was a capital D Democrat, Carl Schurz was a capital R Republican. Held a lot of different positions over the years, fought during the Civil War. He was an immigrant from Germany, lived in a lot of different places. So, to rally the troops for the campaign for ratification, he said, "Forward into the line, Republicans. This is to be the final battle of the war. Let it be the greatest victory of right and justice." The Joint Committee itself is responsible for the second quote there, "To allow them to re-enter Congress before giving adequate security for future peace and safety would mean treason. Defeat in the field has only to take possession of Congress and the cabinet." So the Joint Committee's fear was without an amendment to the Constitution, all of the work of the Congressional Reconstruction would be undone. Andrew Johnson said, "A proper appreciation of the letter and spirit of the Constitution, as well as the interests of the national order, harmony, and union, may at this time well suggest a doubt whether any amendment to the Constitution ought to be proposed by Congress until the southern states were represented." So he didn't give up on that argument. As it was presented to the states, there was another riot. This one in New Orleans on July the 30th, 1866 at the Mechanics Institute Hall. Republicans in Louisiana called a convention trying to force suffrage, black suffrage, in the state constitution. And black supporters, including about 200 black war veterans, marched to the convention site in support of this idea, and they were met by armed whites who were mostly Confederate veterans, including policemen, who attacked the marchers. There were 150 casualties. 35 blacks and 3 whites died. Federal troops eventually intervened to stop the violence. The governor declared the city under martial law for 3 days, and the mayor and the president offered support and praise to the attackers. So this was another one that made national news all across the country and was kind of a backdrop to the ratification argument that summer and fall. Wondered when I'd get to him, didn't you? So the summer and fall of 1866 was not only a campaign to ratify the 14th Amendment in all the states, it was also a midterm election year. So Garfield and all of the members of the House of Representatives are running for election. And in a speech delivered at Warren, Garfield said this: "It is said that the Civil Rights Bill is now law and will give the freedmen adequate protection. Who does not know that the president who vetoes and his Democratic allies who voted against the bill will hasten to repeal it if they ever regain power in Congress? We will accept no securities which are based solely on the promise of perjured traitors. We will accept as the basis for our future peace no mere acts or resolves of rebel convocations or rebel legislatures. The guarantees which the loyal millions of the Republic demand as conditions of restoration must be lifted above the reach of traitors and rebel states and embedded forever in the imperishable bulwarks of the Constitution. Therefore, their loyal representatives in the 39th Congress propose an amendment to the Constitution, which, adopted by 3/4 of the states, will make liberty and union secure for the future." Johnson campaigned against it in what became known as the swing around the circle. He hated the 14th Amendment. Hated it. He hated its broad definition of citizenship. He hated its assertion of national power. He hated its disfranchisements of Southern leaders that he backed. And most of all, he hated that it offered a moderate route to reunification that could be supported by most Americans. If it were ratified by the states, it would destroy his chances of rebuilding a dominant national Democratic Party. So, to defeat the radicals and ensure the rejection of the 14th Amendment, Johnson traveled from the East through the Midwest, repeating the same speech over and over again. He ended up delighting his enemies and appalling his many supporters. He argued with hecklers. He compared himself to Jesus Christ. He found himself abused by the press over and over again. It was a tour it were better had never been made. It's impossible to study Andrew Johnson, said one historian, without marveling at his willingness, indeed his determination, to throw away any chance of success and reconciliation. Even as late as the summer of 1866, he probably could have found his way back to a firm political footing and forced Congress to accept some kind of compromise. But he raced headlong to his own destruction, and he was dashed to pieces on the rock of the 14th Amendment. This map's kind of interesting. This shows how the 14th Amendment was ratified. The blue states ratified the amendment before it was certified as a part of the Constitution. So they ratified between 1866 and 1868. The grayish states ratified afterwards as part of their trying to, coming back into the Union. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment to get back into the Union, so they ratified it afterwards. The purple magenta states rejected the 14th Amendment first and then ratified it later between 1869 and 1976. California ratified the amendment in 1958. Took a while. And then there's those yellow states. Oh, and by the way, Nebraska, that's kind of an interesting story. Nebraska was not a state when the 14th Amendment was submitted to the states, but they had submitted their constitution to be admitted into the Union. And the Republicans sent it back to them and said, you need to take out the part that disqualifies blacks from voting in Nebraska, and if you change that, we'll let you in. So Nebraska was admitted to the Union March 1st, 1867, and Andrew Johnson vetoed it. Yeah. So Congress overrode his veto. Nebraska is the only state in the Union that came in overriding a presidential veto. So that's kind of interesting. He really enjoyed his veto powers. The yellow states are states that changed their mind, and you will note that includes Ohio. Ohio's General Assembly ratified the 14th Amendment on January the 4th, 1867. And then later that year, they had legislative elections, and Democrats won power in the state legislature, so they decided they were going to undo that ratification, and they voted against it. And Secretary of State, who is responsible for counting up all these states' ratifications, they come back in to certify the ratification, decided he was going to ignore that. So in all of the counts of the states that they needed to ratify, they kept counting Ohio and New Jersey and Oregon, who had done the same thing. So they pretended that they had ratified and not taken it back. And Ohio finally got around to undoing their rescission of the 14th Amendment vote in 2003. So they're even slower than California. On July the 20th, 1868, Secretary of State Seward certified the 28 states, 3/4 of the states had ratified the amendment, and it was declared adopted by Congress the next day. So at the same time this ratification battle is going on, there were also the House elections of 1866, and you will notice a very red map here. The new Congress, the 40th Congress, would consist of 47 Democrats and 173 Republicans. It was an absolute veto-proof majority for the Republicans. And The new Congress decided that this whole thing of leaving a giant gap between the time when they were elected and the time when they would first meet was not very good, because Andrew Johnson's still going to be president, right? So their first session would begin, they decided, March the 4th, 1867, when the 39th Congress would end. And then the second session, that one would end on December the 1st, 1867, and the second session would begin the next day. And the third session would begin after the weekend, apparently, and continue until the end of the beginning of March 1868, when a new president would be inaugurated. So that, with the 40th Congress, they ended that crazy calendar where congressmen got elected in November and didn't serve until more than a year later for the first time. Leaves too much mischief for the president to get in. But, of course, the 39th Congress did come back for their second session. And Congressman Garfield said, "It is now our turn to act. The southern states will not cooperate with us in rebuilding what they destroyed. We must remove the rubbish and build from the bottom up." Senator James Grimes of Iowa said, "The president has no power to control or influence anybody, and legislation will be carried on entirely regardless of his opinions and wishes." Johnson was powerless. So, congressional Reconstruction began. Johnson had destroyed himself. He's never going to recover. So by the next year, Congress had taken control of Reconstruction, dissolved all his provisional governments, and instituted direct military control of the southern states, and divided it up into districts that had little to do with state lines. The Republican majority also impeached Johnson, but came one vote short of removing him, and declared that the southern states couldn't apply for restoration until they had ratified the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment is ratified in 1868, and then, of course, court challenges begin. The federal courts refused to even try to make the states live by the terms of the 14th Amendment. They declared that it couldn't possibly have been the intention of the framers to bring the power of bring into the power of Congress the entire domain of civil rights heretofore belonging exclusively to the state governments by subjecting them to the control of Congress. Of the three branches of government, certainly the courts are the most conservative, and the courts looked at the Constitution as they had been interpreting it since the founding and could not believe that war or no war, 14th Amendment or not, that the writers of the 14th Amendment couldn't have intended to take away all the powers that states had had. So they struck down laws intended to protect black Southerners from private political and racial violence. They invalidated the Civil Rights Acts that banned discrimination in public accommodation. Neither the 14th or 13th Amendments, the court said, allowed Congress to step on the domain of local jurisprudence and laid down rules for the conduct of individuals in society toward each other. Finally, in 1869, the court completed what historian Rayford Longford called the betrayal of the Negro in Plessy v. Ferguson, which held that southern states could segregate public places and mass transit by law. The court said, "We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction on it." So there you go. But probably the most significant reading that the court made of the 14th Amendment was when they discovered that corporations are people too. This started with a case that was argued by Roscoe Conkling, Roscoe Conkling was a very interesting character who had a huge political fight with James Garfield in the spring of 1881, quit his seat in the Senate, and because he lost his argument with Garfield, expecting to be reelected by the New York legislature, and that didn't work out so well, so he had to go into private law practice. He took a case that was out of the Southern Pacific Railroad. And the Southern Pacific Railroad was arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court that they, as a corporation, were protected under the 14th Amendment in the same way that people were. And Roscoe Conkling said that, you know, I was in the Congress when the 14th Amendment was debated and argued, and yes, indeed, we truly intended for corporations to be seen as people protected by the 14th Amendment. Okay, so in that case, the court didn't explicitly comment on Conkling's claim. But 4 years later, another Southern Pacific case came up, because they were battling with everybody out there in California. And in that case, the Chief Justice, Morrison Waite, wrote this little foreword. And in the foreword, he said that we're not going to consider whether the provision of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbade a state from denying any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection, applies to corporations. We are all of the opinion that it does. There is no Supreme Court opinion that says the 14th Amendment protects corporations. But there's this preface in a court case that says, yeah, we all think it does. And ever since then, that's the way the 14th Amendment has been interpreted, as protecting corporations. And between 1868, when the amendment was ratified, in 1912, the Supreme Court would rule in 28 cases involving the rights of African Americans and an astonishing 312 cases on the rights of corporations under the 14th Amendment. So what the framers of the 14th Amendment expected it to accomplish disappeared, pretty much. The quote there from Hugo Black is interesting. I like the visual. Black was on the court from 1937 to 1971. So there you go. The 14th Amendment slumbered in the Constitution for more than half a century without beginning to bear out the hopes of its framers. It did not turn Southern states into model republics that Thaddeus Stevens had hoped for. It did not bring the final triumph of the right that John Bingham foresaw. It did not establish once and for all Carl Schurz's Republic of Equal Rights. At the dawn of the new millennium, an eminent historian named David Bryan Davis wrote in the New York Times that the United States is only now beginning to recover from the Confederacy's ideological victory in the Civil War. So the 14th Amendment has been called the second Constitution in length and number of subjects touched. It is by far the most sweeping and complex change ever made. And it was, for most of its history, interpreted in a way that the framers of it probably did not intend. Thank you again, folks. Really appreciate it.